All right, welcome back. Glad that you're with us. And we are going to continue in our study of the Old Testament as we continue to get a little more familiar with what takes place as we read the Old Testament together. Now, we have been going along quite well. We have covered the first 3 volumes of that 5-volume set. Remember that 5-volume set? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We call it the Pentateuch. It can be called the Torah. It can be called the Law of Moses. It comes in many different names. Books of Moses is even a name that's given to it. But what we've done is we covered the first 3 books. Now we're getting into the 4th volume, Numbers. We dealt with Leviticus last, and we found out that Leviticus has more value perhaps than what we had originally thought. Numbers is another one of those books that sometimes people get bogged down with because of, again, the content. Really, we're talking about a negative time period in the fledgling nation's history. And again, we get bogged down in some of the details because of Moses' recording what happened, what took place, and some of the significance of things like numbers of people. That's why we call the book Numbers, because we're talking about, or God takes the opportunity through Moses to number the people. So if we want to take a look at Numbers in an introductory way and in a summary way, we would say this. We would say that Numbers is the account of God leading his people, that's Israel of course, through the wilderness on their way to Canaan, which was of course the rest land that he promised. Now, I don't know how many of you enjoy reading details on directions on maps, but not a lot of people enjoy that. And some of Numbers includes that. We were here, and then we traveled here, and then we traveled here, and then we traveled here. And again, it's the negative part of the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. This is when there is the passing of generations. This is why people get bogged down in this book. And so basically, as we take a look at it, the journey moves from Mount Sinai, because we've been in Mount Sinai when we got to Leviticus, right? That's where we received the law, or that's where the Israelites received the law, figuring out how to worship God, figuring out how to get along with each other. That was all at Mount Sinai. Now what we're doing is we're moving from Mount Sinai to the plains of Moab, which is the opposite side of the Jordan River, which faces Jericho, which will be the first conquest when they finally enter into that land. But we're not ready to go there yet. We still need to see all that happens in the book of Numbers. In fact, I would even say this would be a good exercise for you as you read through Numbers. See how many times the word number or numbers comes up in your reading. You'll find that it comes up several times. One of the easiest ways of finding out why we've named the book we've named Numbers, because we're talking simply about numbers. So let's outline this book. But before we outline the book, let's get an idea of the geography. Okay, the geography of the book of Numbers. Again, in Leviticus, we find ourselves down here, Mount Sinai. We've covered the land of Goshen and crossing the Red Sea and getting down into Mount Sinai. Now, again, Numbers is going to take us from this place up to the plains of Moab, basically opposite of Jericho. Okay? But understand, this length of trip should not take 40 years, maybe 40 days. But not 40 years, okay? And so Numbers records for us why that has been a problem. But yeah, as we said, let's outline it. And what I've done with the book of Numbers is I've divided it up into 3 basic categories, okay? 36 chapters, so one less than Leviticus. 3 basic divisions. First of all, we want to talk about the old generation, right? And the problem with the old generation, which we will get into when we go a little further into our study in Numbers. And then when we go into chapter 15, and basically all it covers is 6 chapters in the book, we talk about the wilderness wanderings. as a result of the rebellion of the old generation, right? That's the reason for the wilderness wanderings. And then the rest of the book talks about the new generation. This is the new generation that will be going into the promised land. And when we come back again for our Thursday night meeting, we'll be seeing how Deuteronomy then helps us to understand again all of this process and the preparation of getting ready for the promised land, because it's going to be a new generation that's going to be hearing about God's law. Okay? But Numbers helps us to see how that transition goes from the old generation, the wilderness wanderings, for the old generation to die off, the new generation to emerge, so that they are ready to cross into the promised land. So a simple way of outlining Numbers for us. By way of background, again, let's talk about how it got its title. And again, the title originated with the Greek Septuagint. That's what that funny thing looks like there. The LXX, that's the Roman numerals for 70. Okay, if you remember back to your old math days and you studied Roman numerals. Okay, the Greek Septuagint, and they named it Numbers. Okay, when we translated into English, it was named Numbers. And that was suggested by, again, there are two numberings, or what we would call censuses, okay, that the people record in the book, or Moses records in the book. So what God wanted them to do at the beginning of the book was number or do a census of the number of fighting men or warriors that they had, okay? And at the end of the book, with the new generation, guess what he's going to ask Moses to do again? To do another census and compare the old number with the new number. And it's quite interesting what we find out when that takes place. So hence, why we call this book Numbers, because of the numbering of the people. Even the Latin Vulgate, okay, the Latin Bible, okay, it named it Liber Numeri, okay, which means simply Book of Numbers. Liber for book, Numeri for numbers, Book of Numbers. Okay, so perhaps one of the easiest ways of understanding why a particular Bible book was named the way it was named. Okay? Numbers means what the title says. Alright? By way of author, of course we know who the author is, right? Moses. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, because we did that when we were talking about it in Genesis and even a little bit of it in Exodus. As far as the date of writing, well, again, we're doing some guesswork here based on some of the evidence inside the text as well as some evidence outside the text. But we would think that, yeah, this was written by Moses when he was at Moab with the Israelites before the end of his life. Remember, Moses does not cross into the promised land. Remember that? And so we would think that with the journey of Numbers being from Mount Sinai up to the plains of Moab, that this would have been written around the time when Moses is getting toward the end of his life and reminiscing and talking with the new generation to help them prepare for the crossing into the promised land. So this would be toward the end of his life, which, if that is the case, takes us possibly at the close of the 15th century BC, okay, to give us an idea of the date. But really what we want to talk about when we get into Numbers is, what are the prominent subjects, right? What are the prominent subjects of this book? What are the key points that we want to focus in on? Well, of course, the censuses, and there are two of them. The first chapter is the first census. The 26th chapter is the second census. What Moses is counting in the first chapter is the number of fighting forces in the old generation. Okay? Talking about the number of fighting forces. And that's what the census was for. Okay? To talk about how many warriors they had. The second census, same subjects for counting, but now a new generation. And what we find is that as we do our calculations and on the basis of the censuses, the total population, not just the fighting forces, okay, but the total population we estimate again to be around 2 million people. Okay? So we're talking about a large group of people. And what is quite interesting is when you compare the numbers of both censuses, there is not a lot of difference in numbers. Okay? There's no great increase, there's no great decrease, but the census numbers that are recorded for us are within a few thousand of each other. Okay?
That's amazing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's quite interesting when you begin to take a look at all of that. The estimate number, the general number for the number of warriors was around 600,000. Okay. So with that, and you start adding into there, well, there'd be spouses, there would be kids, and all the rest of it. That's why we come up with the estimate of around 2 million people. Okay. Now again, that's quite the spread of people. And they're moving from Mount Sinai to the plains of Moab, and they'll travel all over, right? That's interesting in itself. Again, as we talked about before, when they were escaping from Egypt and crossing the Red Sea and all the rest of it, this is a group of people that are raising a bunch of sand when they walk, right? There's probably a big dust cloud as they move, plus a lot of noise, right? Because you got the people, talking with each other, instructions perhaps. They've got all their livestock with them at the same time. The kids are running around, right? All the rest of it. It was a happening place, and as they moved en masse, it would be noticeable. It's not like a family of 4 moving throughout the city of Melfort and basically nobody noticing. No, this would be noticed by the nations round about.
You can see where the people living there would get upset seeing all these 2 million people coming through their land and eat their livestock, eating the food for their livestock.
And the stories that they've heard about these people.
Yeah.
Remember, these are the ones that defeated the mighty Egyptians.
Yeah.
And there'd be all kinds of legend and tale. Some of it true, some of it not true, with regard to how all this happened. So not only would they perhaps be upset, but there would be an element of fear probably as well. If they did that, if they were able to do that with the Egyptians, what are they going to do a little of us? Right? And some of those things. And so rumor, innuendo, legend.
There must have been some running out to get them gifts.
There may have been. The text doesn't tell us, but there would be different responses from different groups of people, right? As they heard the stories and the legends, right? As it would be passed down. So, the censuses, both at chapter 1 and chapter 26, is one of the prominent subjects of Numbers. Also, the final instructions before the journey, before the big journey. This takes us basically from chapters 5 through 10. And what we're going to do here is go into a little detail of what we're finding in the contents of these chapters. The first 4 chapters of Numbers, what they do for us is they record the directions which God gave Moses regarding the preparations for the journey, as especially related to the camp. Again, remember, they are going to move from Mount Sinai. They have been there for about a year, okay, we estimate. And as well as anyone, when you stay in one place for a year, you kind of get settled in, right? You start setting down roots, as we would say. Now what's going to happen is they're going to go on this journey from Mount Sinai. They don't know all of the route that they're taking yet, but they're going to the Promised Land. They don't know where that is, by the way. They're following the leadership of God. But what God is doing now in these first 4 chapters is He's helping them understand how to prepare for this journey that's going to take place. These 2 million plus people as they will move en masse. And so chapter 1, as he says, I want you to count the warriors of the camp. Why would the camp need warriors? Well, again, they're in foreign territory. They're on foreign soil. Not everybody's going to want them there, okay? And so these warriors would be given the opportunity and given the privilege of defending the camp. Chapter 2 helps us to see how God wants to arrange the tribes of the camp, okay? How many tribes? 12. That's right. And when you take 2 million people and you divide them up into 12 tribes, you still have a lot of people in each tribe. Now, certain tribes were bigger than other ones, okay, and that's understandable. But as God would tell Moses how to arrange the tribes in the camp, and I will show you a picture of an artist's rendering of how that may have looked. As they would arrange the tribes in the camp, we estimate that the circumference of the camp itself would probably have been about 12 miles. Okay? So let's think about that for a moment and kind of get ourselves into the mode of understanding the size of what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a possible camp that's in a circumference of 12 miles.
Here to Tisdale.
Well, no, it wouldn't be that far.
Star City,
Star City, yeah.
Yeah. And now you've got that group of people arranged in a particular way, and they're going to move in a particular way, in a particular formation, okay, as they go. So, a 12-mile spot of land, and it just begins to move. That's why God is giving Moses the instruction in chapter 2 as to how to arrange the tribes of the camp. Not how they will just stay in camp, but how they will move en masses of people as well. And they were to move in a particular order so that they would not be destroyed in the process. And then chapters 3 and 4, he talks with Moses as to how to take care of the tabernacle of the camp as well. Because remember, when the tabernacle was designed, it was designed to be moved. Okay?
It's amazing when I read that. How did they do that?
That's right. And that's where the instructions we find in, and this is again where we get bogged down in our reading, right? Because we start getting into details that we don't necessarily understand. And if we're reading in the old English, right, and we're not sure what a cubit is, and okay, it may say 10 cubits, but how long is that? We really don't know, and we start getting bogged down in some of those details. But this is what God is doing as Moses records it for us, as he records it for the camp, as they prepare to go onto this big journey that they're going on. So that's just the first 4 chapters of Numbers. And then when we get into, here's what I promised you. This artist's rendering of perhaps what the camp would look like. Okay? As they would be ready to move or ready to stay wherever they would stay. So the tabernacle is set up right in the middle of the camp. Okay? And then according to this artist's rendering, Moses and Aaron and his tents would be here. And then the tribe of Levi would be kind of camped around there. And then you have all of the other tribes. You have Benjamin, Manasseh, Ephraim, Dan, Asher, Naphtali, Reuben, Simeon, Gad, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. Notice which tribe is probably the largest. Judah, right? But this would be an artist's rendering as to possibly how that all was arranged. Not just for their camping processes, but also for their traveling.
Protecting all sides too.
Protecting all sides. Because who is at the center? The tabernacle. God. That's the presence of God. He's at the center of the camp. Okay? And so no matter where you are stationed in the camp, you can poke your nose outside of your tent flap anytime during the day or night, and you look toward the center of the camp, and what do you see? The pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. Okay? To remind you, and that's probably a pretty big pillar, because remember, if we're talking about maybe a 12-mile circumference of the camp, okay, these poor people at the back rows, okay, to get to the tabernacle, maybe about 6 miles, right?
Would they have had, like the ones that got outside, would they even had guards? Like,
That would be the responsibility of the warriors, and each tribe had their own, okay? And as we found out in chapters 1 and 26 of Numbers, they had about 600,000. Okay? So it's not just a couple of guys on the corner of the camp here and there. We're talking about a good group of people. Okay? As they would camp. So, quite a...
would they move in that formation?
They would move in that formation as well.
So how do they do then? So they come upon obstacles that they have to...
Yeah, the text doesn't tell us, but they worked it out somehow. But again, with that amount of people and that amount of space, whenever they moved, it would be a major event.
You suppose, does this enter into it that there was another reason for the 40 years besides them misbehaving and everything else and teaching them how to live and all that, like we talked about last the fact that if you go this way, there's room enough for us to get through to
Yeah, I mean, God always has all of the details in mind, right?
Yeah.
Even down to details that we can't even imagine. And yeah, there's always a purpose behind what he does. And that may have been one of those purposes, right? As they would move about the land. I mean, again, to any nation that's around about, you get this amount of people moving en masse. Wow, that is a spectacle to behold, and something perhaps to be feared.
Yeah, I just think the cloud of the fire, I mean, when the
Yes.
cloud is there,
Yeah.
I mean, my goodness, I don't know, but,
Mm-hmm. Something's going on,
yeah.
right? Something's going on. So now, as we start into chapter 5 of Numbers, okay, here we now come across the directions that are aimed at individuals within the camp, okay? Again, remember, they're getting prepared for a journey. It's going to be a major journey, okay? Just as major, if not more major, than when they left Egypt to go down to Mount Sinai. So there's certain things that God instructs them that they need to do. Again, this is where we begin getting bogged down in the details of Numbers again. Because one of the things that he wants them to do is to put out the unclean, okay? That which is unclean, in order for you to travel, you've got to get rid of that which is unclean. Put it outside the camp, God says through Moses, okay? Anything that's unclean. And they know what's unclean because remember, they received the law, right? At Mount Sinai, so that now they're starting to put into practice the things that God has been telling them as they prepare for this journey. So one of the things they need to do is they need to put anything that's unclean, they need to put it outside the camp. Which is interesting when we find out and we go, we're not going to take time to get in there, but we find that, you know, there were some people in the camp who still had some idols that they brought along with them, right?
So they went with the idols or just the idols?
They had to find some of those idols and get rid of them, right? Remember? And so, yeah, in order to prepare for this journey, they had to be a clean people. So that which was unclean in the camp, they had to put outside the camp. Not only did they need to be doing that, but they also needed to be taking care of the justice that would be taking place within this group of people. 2 million people, not everybody necessarily was behaving themselves and finding themselves to be violators of the law, right, that God had brought down. And those who were guilty had to be judged. We have to get everything in order. Remember, we're getting ready for a large journey here, so everything has to be put in order. They were also to separate themselves, and here's where we come into an interesting little tidbit that we find in the book of Numbers, which is called the Nazirite vow. And this was, in fact, the Nazirite vow was a vow that we believe the Apostle Paul took at one point in his life, and the results of that are recorded for us in the New Testament. But the one who took the Nazirite vow, they would not cut their hair. Okay, they were not allowed to cut their hair. Well, who is a particular character in the scriptures, Old Testament scriptures, that we remember had long hair? Samson. He took the Nazirite vow from birth. Okay, so they were not able to cut their hair. They were not able to drink wine. They had to abstain from wine. Okay, it was a couple of the instances of the Nazirite vow, and they would keep this vow for a particular period of time. They would choose as to how long that vow would be, and then once they completed the time period of that vow, then they would shave their head, so all the hair would be gone, and to start over again, okay, and be able to imbibe in some of the things that were part of normal life. But those who took the Nazirite vow, those were the ones who separated themselves from the rest of the camp in the sense that they were doing, they were fulfilling a vow and abstaining from things that would normally be taken in by the people. They would stand out in the camp. Okay.
So what kind of vows would they take in doing this? Like what kind of...
Could be pretty well anything and everything. But to take on the Nazirite vow, that just meant that you were separating yourself from and making yourself distinct from the rest of the camp. Okay, and subject to.
Not everybody was required to do that.
Not everyone was required, but it was a voluntary voluntary thing, right? As
Like
vows is
like
voluntary.
being a monk, eh?
Right, yeah. Yeah. Could be connected to that kind of thought, yeah. All right, other preparations, offer gifts. When we're talking about offering gifts there, of course, we're talking about the sacrifices, right? Which would take place on a regular basis, part of their worship. That was to continue, even on their journey. They were also to cleanse the Levites, get the Levites ready for their priestly duty, all right? Which would include a blood sacrifice. And the cleansing would be symbolized, as you had talked about earlier, Adeline, right? The fact that the blood would be put upon the right earlobe, the right thumb, and the right toe, okay? As a sign that they had been cleansed. That was part of the protocol of the cleansing of the Levites. But in order for this journey to take place, the Levites have to be prepared to serve, right? And to be prepared to serve includes the fact that they need to be cleansed. They were to keep the Passover as well. Okay, that was something that they needed to keep to the time when God would say that they didn't need to do it anymore. By the way, Orthodox Jews continue to celebrate the Passover, right? And so even on their journey, the Passover was something that they were to continue to practice. And as God told them, you know what? Since you're going on this long journey, you need to follow your leaders. Okay? And who would those leaders be?
Heads of each tribe.
Well, the heads of each tribe would be part of that, but the major two leaders were whom? Moses and Aaron, right? Aaron was the priestly head, right? Moses was the national head leader, right? And it would be through these two gentlemen that they would lead this nation on its wanderings. It would also be in the book of Numbers where we would begin to see as well a new leader emerge that would take over from Moses, okay? And we'll get into that a little later on. So basically, this is what this book now does for us. In the first 10 chapters, okay? We're reading through the instructions that God is giving His people to prepare them to take this journey to the Promised Land. We haven't got to the rebellious stage yet. We haven't got to the consequences of that yet. But all we're doing here in the first basically 10 chapters is, okay, we're on the move. This is what we need to be doing. This is how we need to prepare, right? And this is what's going on. Now, not terribly exciting stuff, per se, right? I mean, imagine, go back to the time when either you were getting your family prepared to go on a trip, or you, as a child in your family, were getting prepared to go on a big trip. And mom and dad would start handing out the instructions, right, as to what needs to be done in order to prepare to go, right? Well, in my household, when I was growing up, well, the house needed to be clean because we weren't coming home to a dirty house after vacation. And there were certain things that each of us were responsible for to get prepared for this journey. Not all that exciting. I didn't find it exciting at all. I did, like, let's just get in the car and go, right? Let's just get in the car and go. But no, that you had to prepare for all this. Well, this is what God's doing. He's preparing you for the journey, okay? Here's one of the reasons, again, why we get bogged down in the reading, because we're going through a lot of detail that doesn't seem to be relevant. But when we begin to try and place ourselves in the sandals of the people again, then we begin to understand a little better why those instructions are there. Okay?
When I was reading in Leviticus and they're talking about all the sacrifices and their special holidays and everything, like, when did they get any work done? They've been traveling and doing all these sacrifices, and I didn't understand about one part where they had to pour water on it, and I was reading in my things, and the cleansing.
Yes.
You know, and then I thought, well, it's just so interesting that.
When we begin to see the significance of all of that there, then we begin to understand the value of it. And it helps us understand a little better. Well, of course, in all the preparations of this large journey, they get to the place where indeed they are able to spy out the land. Right? Remember that old Sunday school song? 12 men went to spy on Canaan, 10 were bad and 2 were good. Remember that old Sunday school song? That's all in relation to the book of Numbers, specifically chapter 12, verse 16 through to chapter 13, verse 33, where what happens is 12 men are sent to go into the promised land, okay, and they are to spy out the land. And if you remember the account, again, this would be up and around this area, okay? If you remember the account of the spies and their report, when they came back with just incredible stories. This land is richer than we ever thought it would be. They said it's a land that's flowing with milk and honey, which was basically Hebrew idiom that said, everything that we need, everything that we want, it is there. The luxuries of milk and honey, I mean, we're talking about a luxury resort destination here. Okay? The postcards they brought back were just amazing, right? And this was all happening as they were looking into the promised land. And these 12 men would come and report on what they found. But we also know what happened, right? Because as the people, they would be been approaching the land from this direction, from the south, okay? As the people heard the reports of the spies, not all of the spies were on the same page. You remember that, right? In fact, what happened was that the spies, well, not all of them, Joshua and Caleb said, let's go. Get your stuff, let's go. The other 10 convinced the people, we won't survive. We won't survive a week. The people that are in that land are so large, they're so huge, we're like grasshoppers in their sight. They'll squash us like bugs. And so somebody came up with a great idea. Well, let's have a vote. Let's have a vote. And the majority won it. The majority vote won it. They said, no, we're not going. Unfortunately, even though the majority vote won, it was the wrong decision. Because God made the edict, right? The judgment. Because you have rebelled against me, you will stay in the desert wanderings. You will stay somewhere around all here in this area for as long as it takes for this generation to pass off the scene. This generation will not see the promised land. Their kids will, but they won't.
And Joshua and Caleb, did they?
They were the exceptions of the old generation. They were the exceptions of the old generation. Because they were ready to go. In fact, they wept over the decision of the people. And great, great judgment came down. In fact, it's recorded for us that after Moses told the people what God's judgment would be, they tried to convince Moses to go back to God and see whether or not God would be willing to change his mind. Okay, now we know that we can take God seriously. Now we know that we've made the wrong decision. Please, God, give us another chance. And Moses said, it's too late. It's too late. So it was a tragic decision. It was one of those instances where the majority was not right. The vote was not the right vote. And the people received what they wanted. They allowed their fear to paralyze them. And it paralyzed them to the point that they would never experience the promised land. What a tragedy.
Yeah.
What a tragedy. And what seeming purposelessness for 40 years Why are you here? And why are you wandering around in this area seemingly aimlessly? Why this? We're waiting for the first generation to die off. Wow. It just boggles the mind. Now, again, before we get too high on our horses, right? How many times have we found ourselves in a position where we know what God wants us to do, but we allow fear, right? We allow fear to hold us back. And then we wonder why we missed out, or we begin living with regret, right? Those kinds of things. And if only we could change, if only we could go back and change that, right? I mean, I don't know how many times that phrase perhaps was said around the campfires of the camp at night as it would wander around the wilderness for the next 4 years. If only we could turn the clock back. If only we could go back to that time and make that decision a right one, right? But it couldn't be done.
See, I've experienced in my life the opposite. I jumped in both feet optimistically into a bear trap every time I
Yeah. Yeah. It happens that way too. So this is where we begin into the desert wanderings, right? For the next 40 years, these are what we would call transitional years in the history of Israel. By the way, there's not a lot of detail that's given there in those chapters. What's there to tell? The people camped here. And then they moved over to here and they camped here. And then they moved over to here and they camped here. And oh, by the way, then they moved over to here and they camped here. I mean, what is there to tell? Right? For 40 years, it's transitional years. In fact, in a real sense, as we would say, they were years of void. What we mean by that is there's really nothing there. Now, think back for the last 40 years in your life and all the things that have happened in that 40 years, right? None of that really is talked about in the book of Numbers. No details, no great stories, just, yeah, next 40 years, same old, same old.
You know, it's that older generation, and they have kids, maybe grandchildren, and thinking, my choice has caused my generations to walk for 40 years. And what a guilt you carry. My goodness.
A heavy burden.
Yeah. It would just, every day would be heavier than the one before.
Because as we continue to look at it, geographically, if we're just going to take a look at geographically for the next 40 years, they neither advance nor retreat. They just keep, it seems that they just keep going around in circles. And they don't make any progress anywhere, they don't digress anywhere, they just keep spinning their wheels in that same point. In fact, when we go back to our map, notice how there's a break in this red line, okay, marking their journey. Why is that break there? Because somewhere around in here is where they wandered for the next 40 years. We can't follow the trail very well in our present maps. But that's why the break's there in that map, because that's basically the 40 years of void.
What the people of the land were thinking as they're going round and round and round.
Right. These are quite the nomadic people, right? They never settle down. They just keep on moving somewhere without seemingly any rhyme or reason. As far as the population was concerned, okay, we have 600,000 warriors who met their appointed death, along with their family, along with their families, if they had any, right? And it would be through the 40 years that a new generation would appear. Okay? So as the babies were being born, this would be the new generation that would take on the role that the old generation refused. Okay? And this was the new generation that God was preparing. Spiritually speaking, new seeds of hope were being sown. Oh yes, they're still under judgment. They're still dealing with the consequences of judgment. But every time you heard a cry of a newborn from your neighbor's tent, every time you were perhaps at the baby shower of the new child that was born, as the camp would celebrate the new births that would be taking place within them, each one of those were new seeds of hope that were being sown. This was going to be the generation. This was going to be the generation that would go. So now, not only perhaps is the old generation dealing with guilt, but also the old generation is now perhaps dealing with envy or regret. Because as each child's cry is heard, that's the new generation getting ready. That's the new generation getting ready. New seeds of hope are being sown. The original covenant that God had made with his people, the original promise that he had made with his people, was being reaffirmed every time there was a new child being born. God hadn't forgotten them. For a time they were going to be, as it were, put on the shelf. But it was all for the purpose of getting ready to cross into that promised land again. Isn't it interesting? God's plans. I mean, God had planned for his people to enter into the promised land from the very point in which they left Egypt. Even before they left Egypt, he talked about a promised land, right? And you would think that, okay, that means that they have to be in this promised land at a certain time, and we better make it, or else everything's going to blow apart. Well, isn't it interesting? What we would think from our perspective was a 40-year delay, right? They entered into the promised land 40 years late. Not on God's time. Not on God's time. If this generation didn't want to cross, fine. It'll be the next generation. And if it's going to take 40 years to get there, not a problem. We can squeeze that in, right? And so this is what's happening spiritually during this time as well. New hope, the reaffirmation of God's covenant and promise. And so by the time we get to chapter 22, we're at the gate to the land again. We're getting ready to cross. That's why a new census is ordered by God. All right? Let's count now how many we have in the new generation. Okay? And again, as I said before, there isn't a lot of difference between the count of the first census and the count of the second census. Okay? It's not exact. It's not the exact number, but it's only within a few thousand. Okay? When you get down to it. And we are also introduced to the fact that there's going to be a new leader as well. Okay? Because it's in Numbers where we come across Moses' disobedience to God. Remember, he was to speak to the rock because the people were wanting water. He was to speak to the rock, and instead of speaking to the rock, he struck it twice with his staff out of his anger against the complaining of the people. And after the people received their water, the Spirit of God tapped Moses on the shoulder and says, "You and I need to have a discussion." And it was that discussion where Moses found out, okay, because of your disobedience, you're not going to be entering the promised land. I'll let you have a look. I'll let you have a look. But you won't enter.
It must have been heartbreaking.
It was, I'm sure, heartbreaking. But at the same time, God reassured Moses as well, but all is not lost. There will be one who will replace you, and he will be a great leader, as you have been a great leader. And his name? Joshua. We'll talk about Joshua later when we get to his book. But here in the book of Numbers is where we are introduced to the people at the gate of the new land, getting ready to enter in. It'll be the book of Deuteronomy that records for us Moses' final instructions to this new generation before they cross in. Okay? But Numbers gets us there. Numbers gets us to that place where they're about ready to cross. And so, Numbers, as we said from the very beginning, takes us all the way from Mount Sinai, all the way up to the plains of Moab, opposite Jericho, on the east side of the Jordan River, getting ready to cross. Can you imagine the excitement? Can you imagine the anticipation? This new generation, as they hear the stories of the old generation, of what God did, and as they hear the stories of what the old generation said about God promising them a promised land, and now they're basically staring at it across the river. Okay? Getting ready to cross. So we find that basically what happens is that there has been a lot of learning that has been going on during this time, right? One of the things they learned, of course, is that they must trust God, not people, in the day of crisis. What was the day of crisis for the old generation? When the spies came back and said, it's a great land, but you and I have no chance whatsoever of ever entering that land because of the obstacles that are there before us. They had entered a day of crisis. And who did they trust? Themselves. Remember the boat? Instead of trusting God. I mean, God's done this for us so far. He's taken us all this way so far. What on earth are we thinking? That God has just brought us here for us to be squashed by these people? That doesn't sound like the promise of a promised land. There's something wrong with this equation. Well, they trusted in themselves and they trusted in their own abilities rather than trusting God. That was one of the things that the children of the new generation learned as they trekked the wilderness with their forefathers. They also learned that God would supply all their need according to his riches. It's here in the book of Numbers where we find that God provides them with food. Remember what kind of food it was? They called it manna, right? And every single morning, except for Sabbath morning, every single morning when they poked their nose out of the tent flap of their tent, they would find the ground covered with manna, enough to sustain them for the day. They didn't have to plant it. They didn't have to cultivate it. They didn't have to harvest it. It was there, made available for them. And Moses does his best to try and describe for us what this manna was like and what it kind of tasted like, right? But we're not quite sure what it was all about. But he did give them food. But you know what people are like, right? After 4 years of the same thing every day, for 4 years, you get a little perhaps tired of it, right? And when you get tired of it, what do you begin to do? You begin to complain, right? Now, whether or not they had different ways of fixing it and all the rest of it, I have no idea. But the fact of the matter was that they began to complain again, right? God supplied for them every single morning. I mean, they didn't have to lift a finger to feed themselves, right? And so they began to complain that they didn't have any meat. Well, what did God do? He gave them their meat. Now, they learned a lesson in the process, right? Because when God caused the quail to come into the camp, there was so much meat, there was so much quail that they couldn't handle it all. In fact, they even got sick of that. But they whined and cried for meat. Okay, God gave them meat. When they needed water, what did God do? He gave them water from the most seemingly inappropriate places. I mean, we talk about trying to get blood from a stone, and it's an idiom that tells you don't get blood from stones. That's why it's a hard thing to think or grasp. Where were they getting their water from? The rocks, right? And as Moses would speak, the water would come forth enough to feed. Again, remember, a camp, 12 miles in circumference. That's a lot of water. We're not talking about a few bucketfuls. We're talking about a gusher, right? And not only feeding, or not only watering themselves, but again, their livestock, right? All the rest of it. God provided that for them. He gave them leaders as well. Moses, Aaron. They didn't go willingly into this leadership role. Remember, when we go back to Exodus and Moses' conversation with God about being the leader of this people, Moses did not go willingly, but eventually he went. Aaron was about the same way, but these would be the leaders, and God gave them the leaders that they would need. He also gave them the promised land as well. So this was something else that the children of the new generation would learn. Not just to trust God in the day of crisis, but also that God was one that would supply their needs. So as the questions may come, well, once we get into the promised land, how are we going to feed ourselves? How are we going to water ourselves? How are we going to arrange all of this? The new generation would be able to say, well, look at what he's done for us so far. Why would we have any doubt about what it is that he would do for us as we go into the promised land? Well, that brings us to the final question. That common question that we have as we come to the end of each Old Testament book. You know what that question is? So what? Okay. Numbers, a great account about the journeys of the nation of Israel as they go from Mount Sinai up to the plains of Moab, getting ready to cross into the promised land. And what happens in their sin and rebellion and how they work all of that through. I mean, great accounts, great story that happened so long ago. What does it mean for me? Does it mean anything for me? I ask the question, well, okay, so what? Well, some things that we need to consider. First of all, I think Numbers is like a mirror for us to look in. Every time I read about the people and their responses and their reactions to the situations and circumstances of life, you know who I see? I see me. When you get right down to it. I see me. And that happens for any of us who read the book of Numbers. That what Numbers does for us is help us to understand a little clearer what the human condition is like. Depending on the situations and circumstances of life, we either are finding joy or we're finding something to whine and complain about. Right? And it's all related to what circumstance of life we find ourselves in. Numbers shares with us the human condition and what we really are like. And how God is so patient with the human condition. Right? Several times he could have said to Moses, and he did on occasion, let's just snuff these people out and let's start over clean and fresh. Right?
But that would make any difference.
Yeah. Well, that would be the thing. See, it wouldn't make much difference because the human condition is the human condition. Right? The only one that can change the human condition is Jesus Christ. Right? But that's what Numbers does for us. It's like a mirror for us to look in. And what it does is our heart is exposed with its many sinful tendencies. We have to be, when we read this book, we have to be honest with ourselves. And we have to come to the point of understanding, this is what I'm like. And you see, that's half the solution to the problem, is it not? If I begin to understand what I'm like, then I begin to have a comprehension of what I need. And what do I need? The same thing that these people needed. A redeemer. Someone who would provide for them. Someone who would deliver them. Someone who would look after them. Someone who would lead them. Right? That's what they needed. Guess what? That's what I need too. Because their condition is no different from my condition, or I should say my condition is no different from their condition, and I need the same thing that they realize they need. And so, am I like the old generation that wanted to do it on my own, or am I like the new generation that learned from the mistakes of the old generation and said, okay, we better listen this time. We better listen to what God wants. Because the prominent sin of the book of Numbers is basically this. First, unbelief and disobedience, right? God promised them a promised land. We don't believe it. Those guys are too big. They'll squash us like bugs. And there's your unbelief. And disobedience in the fact that God says we need to go in and take the land. You can go if you want, but I'm going to stay here. Right? Unbelief and disobedience. This murmuring against God. Yeah. We have that tendency, right?
Is lamenting about the same?
Yeah, lamenting could be, yeah. In fact, it's interesting, when you go into the original language, back into the Hebrew, the word that they use for murmuring, or that we translate murmuring, in the Hebrew language, that's what it sounds like when you speak it over and over and over again. It sounds like you're murmuring. Yeah. And that was the prominent sin that was being revealed and exposed in this book of Numbers. It helps me to understand my condition. Because really, as Paul provides for us, the things that happen here in Numbers are examples to us. Numbers is a great object lesson for us that illustrates even how God desires to deal with us today. As we close out this, let's go to the New Testament and let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Because this solidifies for us the value of the book of Numbers. Notice what Paul writes, the apostle, as we're in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 1. He writes, "Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink." What's Paul referring to when he says, all our fathers? He's talking about the Old Testament saints. He's talking about Old Testament Israel. Remember? They were the ones that were under the cloud. The cloud of what? The cloud of God's presence, right? They were the ones who passed through the sea. What sea is that? We're talking about the Red Sea crossing. They're the ones that were baptized in Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Remember the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night that talked about the presence of God. They all ate the same spiritual food in allusion to the manna that was provided, right? They all drank from the same spirit. They all drank the same spiritual drink, alluding to, spiritually speaking, the water that would come that was provided by God in the wilderness, right? Now notice what he writes. "For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ." Paul is making some striking allusions here that Moses and the Old Testament people would understand this then. But Paul is bringing that connection now. He's talking about the Old Testament experiences of the Old Testament fathers, right? And notice what he writes in verse 5. "But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness." Remember that, right? Because of their disobedience, their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now, here's the point that he's making. Verse 6. "Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted." Notice what Paul is saying here. Look at the lives and how they lived them back in the day. Those stories, those accounts that we are so familiar with. And they were very familiar with. He says, don't lose the value of that. What was preserved for us in those accounts, what was preserved for us in those stories, is they are object lessons to us. So that we can learn from that. So we're not making the same mistakes they made. So that we're continuing to cultivate our relationship with God in such a way that we are successful rather than failures. So now what Paul does is shares with the Corinthian people the value of what was recorded for us in the Old Testament. The same for us today. There's value here to this book. It's not just an account of what happened in the days of old, but it helps me understand I need to learn from them. So with my tendency for unbelief and disobedience, I need to do something opposite of that. With my tendency to murmur against God, especially when things in life aren't going the way in which I think they should go. Rather than murmur, I need to learn what happened to the previous murmurers. And understand that I need to be different from them. Numbers, a great book. And even in the midst of all of the detail that we might find in there, there's that snippet of truth, that understanding that, hey, I can learn from them. So let's do that. Let's learn from them. And let's see what we do different. Not, again, for our glory, but of course, for the glory of God. Let's pray. Father, thanks again for your word. What it provides for us. How we can grow in our relationship with you as we would even learn from others. And Father, as we've recognized tonight, the book of Numbers does that for us. Oh, Father, give us a love for your word. Give us a love for it in such a way that we would read it so that we can not just understand what's going on, but we can see what needs to happen in our own lives as we walk with you. Thank you, Father, for this time. Encourage us as we continue our study. We pray it